Hi, I'm actor Ian Champion, and welcome to History of Horror Cinema, my personal podcast tour of the good, bad, and the ugly of horror movie history. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe. Godzilla on Film, A Prehistory, 1853 to 1954. In his May 2005 UCLA lecture entitled Godzilla and Post-War Japan, Professor William Tsutsui quoted a 1985 survey of Americans in which they were asked to name 3 famous Japanese people. The results revealed much about how this still foreign country was perceived by its former enemy of 40 years before. The most popular responses were Emperor Hirohito, so far so good, Bruce Lee, news to him and his fellow Hong Kong Chinese, and Godzilla. While this last answer is somewhat confused as to what defines a person, it gave 2 valuable insights: that a Far Eastern fictional dinosaur had now bestrode the Western world like a rampaging colossus, and that he was imbued with a recognizable personality, arguably even humanity in a sense, that encouraged respect, awe, and fanatical love across a truly global fanbase. On one level, over time, the Godzilla movies became increasingly madcap escapism, a ringside seat for us to watch guys in rubber suits battering each other, as well as realistic miniature Tokyo cityscapes. The original inspiration for Godzilla's creation, however, was a somber and compelling mix of science fiction and devastating real-world tragedy. He was to be a unique monster, born during uniquely harrowing post-war circumstances for his homeland, and, like many children, bore a fascinating imprint of his creators, the sum of their fears. The century in history of Japan's relationship with the West had begun hesitantly. Until the 1850s, theirs had been an isolated society closed off to any influence from the outside world. Only repeated pressure from Russia and other nations forced the reluctant Tokugawa government to cautiously open up a few strictly controlled ports to international trade. While ultra-conservative samurai factions strongly opposed these external relationships, many saw the advantages to be gained from Western advances in science and the military. In fact, it was the threat of the superior firepower technology of the United States Navy under Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853–54 that persuaded them to open up their borders. After the fall of the ruling Tokugawa shogunate, Emperor Meiji became imperial ruler of a country that now found itself signatories to unfair treaties, favoring their Western partners, both economically and legally. The only way Meiji could restore his country to respect on the international stage was to undertake drastic reforms. Japanese society was leveled into a full democracy, wiping out the privileges that the samurai military class and daimyo, feudal lords, had previously enjoyed. The emperor also insisted on a radical program of westernization for his people. To develop from their agrarian into a modern industrial nation, many scholars were sent abroad. Foreign teachers were invited to lecture in Japan, and compulsory education was decreed for all. The country's armed forces were revolutionized by universal conscription and overhauling the navy and army along British and Prussian models respectively. As part of its societal remodeling, Japan established its first parliament, the Diet, in 1889. Though Meiji was the sovereign, he was artful in negotiating with the elderly Genro oligarchy who controlled the real reins of power. For the public's view of their modern government, look no further than the first Godzilla film's Japanese release in 1954, where the only time a city landmark's destruction was cheered at was the Diet building. Japan began to flex their new military muscle and incur the stirrings of future hostility with the West with 2 wars over territory. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894–95 against China won them Taiwan, but due to the triple intervention of Russia, France, and Germany, they were forced to return others. The Russo-Japanese War in 1904–1905, disputing Korean and Manchurian strategic land, resulted in Russian army and navy defeats, which gave Japan a new respect in the world as valuable as their annexation of Korea in 1910. It was in the era following Emperor Meiji's death in 1912, succeeded by the enfeebled Emperor Taisho, that relations between Japan and Western nations started to deteriorate into ultimate conflict. They had joined the Allies in a minor capacity during the First World War, but it was their membership of the League of Nations that became a flashpoint for mounting international mistrust. Japan's hoped-for racial equality clause amendment to its covenant was rejected by the USA, Australia, and Britain. When the United States passed the Oriental Exclusion Act in 1924, blocking future immigration into America, Japanese people perceived themselves as the intended targets. Mirroring the bully's victim who becomes an aggressor himself, the Japanese subjected China to the same political and economic equality that they had suffered earlier under the West. The 1930s saw them puff up their chests to a state of military hubris that would eventually be their undoing. Japanese forces occupied Manchuria in 1931, then virtually the whole Chinese coast in the Second Sino-Japanese War that ran from 1937 concurrently with the Second World War till both ended in 1945. In this period, China endured monstrous atrocities under the occupying Japanese. Meanwhile, Japan added French Indochina, Vietnam, to their territories, then sided with the Axis powers of Germany and Italy, a move that inexorably headed them toward full-scale war with the Allies. The Japanese capture of Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies then, and its vital oil reserves was followed a year later by their fateful sudden bombing of the U.S. naval base at Hawaii's Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The element of surprise gave Japan 6 months of territorial advantage until the Battle of Midway in June 1942 signaled a gradual Allied clawback of land. By 1945, the Allies had made punishing airstrikes upon Japan and seized their island of Okinawa in a notorious battle. The Potsdam Declaration's formal request for Japan's unconditional surrender on July 27, 1945, fell on deaf ears. Thus was triggered the most notorious military action in history. On August 6th, the world's first weaponized atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, obliterating 80,000 people and 90% of the city. Within 3 days, another was deployed over Nagasaki, leaving a human death toll of 40,000. Despite these unimaginable actions, and Russia's entry into the war against Japan, Emperor Hirohito held out until August 14th, when his dual radio broadcast played to the Japanese nation, accepting the terms for surrender. He had no choice but to realize the shattering power their enemy wielded, a weapon he described as a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, and that without their acceptance, more than just his people's future was at stake. It would lead to the total extinction of human civilization, he said. After paying tribute to those most devastated by the bombings, the emperor urged his people to begin the hardly conceivable task of rebuilding wrecked lives and cities. When he referred to the hardships and sufferings to which our nation is to be subjected hereafter, he could not have imagined that a nuclear shadow would once more be cast over his subjects, nor that, through the arts, they would find a truly remarkable way to come to terms with their legacy. The Shadow of the Bomb, 1945 to 1954. Any hope that the end of World War II would also end use of the Allies' new near-apocalyptic trump card was extinguished by U.S. President Truman's decision in December 1945 to begin joint Army and Navy nuclear testing, as if Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not a horrific enough proof of concept. Once brought into play, such a hideously effective tool could not be de-invented. Instead, it was to be refined to determine the effect of atomic bombs on American warships. The chosen location was Bikini Atoll, part of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean, north of the equator. This once idyllic spot was considered remote enough for safety, though in a grotesque irony, Commodore Ben H. Wyatt, the Marshall's military governor, convinced the Bikinians to leave temporarily on the pretext that codename Operation Crossroads was for the good of mankind and to end all world wars. Japan's connection to the Marshalls dated back to their administration of them in the early 1900s. During the war, they maintained a strategic military outpost at Kwajalein Atoll. In February 1944, a brutal battle resulted in its capture by U.S. forces. Now its Bikinian neighbor was to play host to a far more destructive occupier, whose influence was to involve the Japanese with equally terrible consequences. 2 early tests on Bikini Atoll in 1946 were filmed, dropping nuclear payloads of a scale similar to Nagasaki. These were merely dry runs for a more potent project of 1,000 times greater magnitude. In the early 50s, the icy wind of the Cold War chilled the U.S. government with fears that Russia was secretly testing their own advancing nuclear capability. Plans were stepped up to unleash Operation Castle's Bravo bomb on the northwest corner of the atoll, the most powerful hydrogen bomb the world had ever seen. American arms race paranoia may explain, though never justify, why on the 1st of March 1954 Joint Task Force 7 went ahead with the Bravo air detonation, despite clear evidence that wind direction would irradiate the northern Marshall Islands and their inhabitants. The Defense Nuclear Agency reported, "It was recognized that both Bikini and Eneman Islands would probably be contaminated. Like some horrific sorcerer's apprentice, the damage from the resulting 15-megaton blast exceeded its master's expectations by 2.5 times, vaporizing all island vegetation within a 66-mile radius and injecting incalculable radiation into the surrounding atmosphere." Amongst the spectators watching the awe-inspiring mushroom cloud were the 23-man crew of the Japanese fishing boat Daigo Fukuryo Maru, Lucky Dragon 5. Whilst every effort was seemingly made to notify all outlying vessels, this lone one was not so lucky. Tragically, the time it took the men to retrieve their nets before fleeing exposed them and their haul to several hours of radioactive fallout. They were transfixed by the gritty white ash that rained down on them 2 hours later, not knowing the deadly confetti's properties would soon induce radiation sickness in the form of itching, vomiting, and nausea, after which one man died. There were even more sickening repercussions as much of the ship's irradiated tuna cargo would find its way onto dinner tables back home. Of course, the fate of the Lucky Dragon 5 was a small example of the far wider effects of the Bravo bomb. Residents of Rongelap Atoll, roughly 125 miles from Bikini, would see similarly awful side effects in their people. It is a damning indictment of the U.S. government's handling and irresponsibility that no inhabited islands were forewarned about the inevitable falling debris and its toxicity, a poisonous snow under which children innocently played in wonder. But the shock waves emanating from Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and now Bikini Atoll were to reverberate long after their aerial bursts, echoing in the Japanese conscience. And one of the first cultural expressions of this hideous coming to terms would be rendered a mere 6 months later through the lens of the horror motion picture, as we shall see. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe.